The Academy of Criminal Justice Sciences, in conjunction with the Oral History Criminology Project, is pleased to present a conversation with Gennaro F. Vito. He joins us, or we join him, I should say, in his office here on May 15th, 2018, at the University of Louisville. Just a brief bit of a background here for those viewers who are not yet familiar with Dr. Vito and his work before we get into sort of the substance of his life and his academic career. In terms of his education, he's earned quite a few degrees, beginning in 1972 with a BA from the SUNY College, S-U-N-Y, College at Cortland in History, continuing on to earn a Master's in History in 1974 from SUNY College at Fredonia. In 1976, he begins his foray into more scholarly activity at the Ohio State University. 1976, earning an MA in Sociology and Criminology, making that transition from history to criminology. An MPA from the Ohio State University in 1977, and concluding his work there in 1978 with a doctoral degree in public administration. Over the years, he's held a number of academic positions, beginning in Philadelphia at Temple University, where he served as an assistant professor from 1980 to 1983, then transitioning to California State University, Long Beach, as an assistant professor from 78 to 1980, and then landing at his longtime home here at the University of Louisville in 1983, where he's worked his way from assistant professor at what was then a Department of Justice Administration. I presume that's an LEAA. Justice Administration, then to full professor in 1989 with the Department of Criminal Justice, which it remains to this day. He served as chair and vice chair and graduate program coordinator over that period of time, his tenure here. He's also served as program faculty administrative officer's course with the Southern Policy Institute, which is right next door. Along the way, Dr. Vito has earned a number of awards and distinctions from a number of bodies, including the University of Louisville. He's earned the Exceptional Performance Award in 1999, the Dean's Award for Outstanding Scholarship, Research, and Creative Activity in 2002, and that same award from the President's Office in 2002 as well. He's served as Distinguished University Scholar from 2008 to 2014, and named as one of the top 25 criminal justice professors by Forensic College website, which is a nice honor as well. In 2014, he was named by the University of Louisville as a university scholar. The Academy of Criminal Justice Sciences has bestowed several awards upon Dr. Vito as well. He's elected Academy Fellow in 1992, served as president in 1998, where he delivered a presidential address that we'll be referring to throughout. I would highly recommend that as a nice compendium of his thoughts on quite a few things with the field. This presidential address entitled Research and Relevance, the Role of the Academy of Criminal Justice Sciences. He's earned the Outstanding Mentor Award from the ACJS as well in 2010. And lastly, most recently, the Bruce Smith Senior Award in 2012. He's also earned another number of miscellaneous honors. The National Institute of Justice bestowed a doctoral fellowship in 1978. He's also served as visiting scholar at the University of Nebraska, I suspect connecting with Chris Eskridge at that point, reconnecting with Chris Eskridge at that point. He was named Educator of the Year by the Southern Criminal Justice Association in 1991. He's authored 12 books, dozens of articles, book chapters, and a number of technical reports along the way as well. From this interviewer standpoint, he's spanned the field of criminal justice with his varied research interests. Just sort of a truncated list, an abbreviated list, includes police administration, capital punishment, race and criminal justice, sentencing policy, sentencing practice, research methods, statistics, substance abuse, probation, and program evaluation. So before you became interested in this laundry list of things, you were just sort of a young boy growing up. Can you give us a little bit of sort of a backstory here in terms of?
Well, my father always encouraged me to go to college, so I did.
Okay.
I always tell my AOC class, the police officers, that my short biography is I went to college and never left. So in 1968, I went to college. I'm still here.
Oh, right. So what was the encouragement for?
Just to, my father was a police officer, and he wanted me to get an education.
Okay.
And he saw it as a way to a better life. So
All right.
when I went to Cortland, I was interested in history, and the trouble was there were no jobs then for history teachers in high school. So I got a bachelor's degree, and then Fredonia had a community college teaching program, and still I didn't get the message because they didn't need anybody for history. but the department offered me an assistantship, so I took it. But then again, I would hear from when I finished, and I was applying to doctoral programs in history, like Michigan, they tell me, well, we'd be glad to have you, but there are no jobs. Yeah. So while I was looking for jobs, community college jobs, I kept seeing criminal justice announcements. And my one colleague, Tom Palucci, who was the GA in history with me, said he was going to change fields and go to Ohio State and get into physiological psychology, and he did. And I said, well, give me a catalog. So it was, serendipity. My father thought I was crazy. I just showed up at Ohio State, in one of the top programs in criminology, and said, here I am, with no background really in the area. So I started over.
Huh. Do you see any biographical connection to sort of your father's profession and some of the research interests?
Yeah, that's what everybody thinks, but,
Yeah.
that would require planning and thought. I don't think there was much planning and thought. It was more like, where can I move on and get into a field where there is some demand for professors.
So very much practically.
Very much practical. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I'd been impractical long enough.
So you arrive at Ohio State University.
State.
Can you give us it's a storied program, right?
Yes.
It's one of the few that has sociology and criminology
together. Yeah, and at that time, Joe Scott was running a project on shock parole, and I got involved in that as a work study student. And then I completed my degree, and then I heard about public administration, and Harry Allen was operating a program for study of crime and delinquency, and I went over to public administration, which was actually a much better fit for somebody that didn't come up through the ranks as a sociologist. Yeah. They at that time, public administration programs were strictly graduate. So you didn't have an undergraduate degree in public administration and go on. So they were used to accepting people from different disciplines and training them. So, and that got me into applied research. I mean, at the program, what we did primarily was evaluations of programs funded by LEAA. So someone would get funding and then evaluation would be required. Often they wouldn't think of it until it was the end of the grant and they had to have an evaluation, and that would present a lot of methodological problems for us, but that's what I broke in as. There was no I was strictly a research associate because there was no one to teach really. We didn't have an undergraduate program, so.
So how did you make a transition from history over into criminology and sociology?
Well,
were you taking anything with you?
I didn't really have much of I had like one course when I was undergraduate in sociology, but in history I studied Nazi Germany and Hitler, so that's not a big jump when you're talking about crime and social justice and everything else. That topic did fit more or less. But in terms of research methods, statistics, all that was new to me. I knew, the tools that you need to do this work.
So why not continue on the tangent with public administration? It sounded like they were going to allow you to do the kinds of things that you were interested in doing. What drew you back into the orbit of criminology and sociology?
Well, the program then was wide open in terms of electives. So I took research methods, statistics classes from sociology department. I took criminology classes from sociology department. Cy Dinitz, Joe Scott, Richard Lundman, and then so a lot of it was subject area was in there. But then in public administration, we took program evaluation, planning, We took organizational behavior and theory from the business school. So we got the background there to do policy research, really. And that's what we focused on.
And so, could you give us a little bit more about sort of the people and the ideas that you were encountering at that particular point in time?
Well, it was really interesting because Harry at that time, after I was there a year or two, he became president of ASC.
Huh.
And the ASC office, in fact, was right in the middle of the program for offices. You know, Sarah Hall typed my dissertation. so I was right in the thick of it. Dinitz was really influential. I took many theory classes from him, and Joe Scott as well. And Lundman, at that time, that was the only class I'd ever had on policing. And thank God it was from him, because we reviewed the literature, you know, we really got into it. And what killed me was he more or less said, well, I just did that as a dissertation topic. I really wasn't that interested in the police. I said, yeah, but, you know, he gave me a really firm background in that area that I wouldn't have had otherwise. Because the focus of really the program and our research was mostly corrections. You know, we didn't do any policing programs and evaluation.
Are you simultaneously getting out into the field and collecting data?
Yes.
At this point as well?
That's mostly what we did.
What kinds of things were you going into prisons and
Yes.
talking to administrators,
Yeah.
and survey instrumentation?
The first project was, there was a national study going on halfway houses. And they just wanted to find out how many there were, what they did, how they were funded. So we did a survey, and, you know, at that time you had the Watts line was a big deal. You know, you get on the Watts line, not pay, you know, outrageous phone charges. But we had this interview form that was several pages long that would require, we mail it to the house and say, look up your budget and all these things, fill it out. Then we'll call you up and go through the interview. So that's what we did. Then we took a subset of those and did site visits. Like I went to Philadelphia, just down the street from Temple, oddly enough, to visit a halfway house. I went to Washington, D.C. and visited a halfway house. And then I talked to the administrators, I talked to the residents and interviewed them. So that was the first real project that I worked on. But then we did others, like I evaluated a drug treatment program in a prison. There was a therapeutic community up in Marion, Ohio. And the person running it was working on his PhD in psychology, so he had it all laid out in terms of data and surveys and everything else. So that helped a lot.
I suspect that when it came time to write your dissertation, you weren't in want of data.
No. What happened was the Department of Rehabilitation and Corrections wanted yet another evaluation of shock probation. I mean, I was like the third one.
Huh.
In fact, Ed Bolander, that did it first, ended up teaching down here at Western Kentucky. Although we've never met, our paths have crossed a lot. So like I said, I was like the third or fourth one to look at that.
And so that became your dissertation?
That became my dissertation, and I went to Harry and I said, what's this NIJ fellowship? You know, because it came across our desk, and he said, oh, I'm on the board to evaluate it. And I said, well, when were you going to tell us about it? You know, so I said, I'm applying for one. And so did Eskridge, you know, we both got one. So then my job the last year was my dissertation. So that was great. You know, it just allowed me to focus, and in fact, it allowed me to hire Latessa to work on it with me. So it all came together really nicely, and we had really good data.
So that began the process of sort of growing this agenda outward, right?
Mm-hmm.
Could you give us a little bit of indication here in terms of, do you see this as all sort of part of one larger omnibus project here, all these varied elements, or do you think that they all cohere around a particular narrative?
Well, since I was brought up that way, I always had emphasis on evaluation and policy. In other words, in fact, when Ron Holmes and I did the first edition of our criminology book, that's what we focused on. We said, you know, here's theory, here's practice, all right, and here's the research that comes out of that. And that's the way I've always looked at it.
Okay.
So, because the good policy should be based on sound theory and be supported by research. I mean, we see that now with, what Cincinnati has done with what works in corrections. There's a lot of programs in policing that have been proven effective, like hotspots and pulling levers and things like that. So I've really, I've been able to see that through the years, that this has really come about, reached fruition and had an impact on the field and on life in general.
Yeah. You talked about that a little bit about that in your presidential address.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned a particular bill that had an effect here in Kentucky. And you talked about being sort of in the crosshairs of some of the political back and forth. Could you give us a little indication here in terms of how that demand to fit sort of an academic profile and just be interested in the science and the data meet with this interest in advancing sort of a better notion of how the world actually ought to operate?
Well, when I started studying program evaluation, the advice always was, and some of this came from an article Jim Inciardi did years ago, you have to work with the people and say, look, what are your goals? What are your objectives? How do you measure them? What do you want to know about the program? What do you think success is? How would you define success? And then can we measure that and see, look at outcomes and results? And then the next thing is, you have your input on that. That's important. But then when it comes to the results, that's it. I just tell you what it is, and you have to live with it. Mm. And that's not always, when you get to the end point, that's not always a chummy relationship, let's say. Because, they might agree to that, but then when it's negative, or even sounds a little bit negative, because the people have spent their time developing this program, they're invested in it, so naturally they're not going to. It's a lot like when you get a review back on a journal article. It takes a while to simmer down and say, okay, I see what you're saying, and this is what I need to fix, and things like that. So it's kind of natural, but you got to get that relationship set up front. You got to do that up front. Because it's always, and you're going to get a lot of pressure to try to make the results palatable or give them what they want, and even when it comes out positive for the program or the policy, there's still some reservations in there.
Now, there are two different things that I'm kind of thinking of right now here. One of the things here is, some of the difficulty is sort of the practical versus the academic kind of divide here,
yes.
Right? There seems to be a natural aversion, in some cases an outright antipathy on those who are practitioners towards academics like us,
yes.
who sit around and read books and run
right.
regression analyses.
Right.
How is it that you go about the process of cultivating those relationships behind the scenes to gain enough buy-in, but at the same time, still...
I think the more you work with them, that kind of develops. In some cases it's been really hard. In other cases it's been easy. I know with corrections, corrections was used to us coming in and doing research. All of it. There was just a lot more than there was in policing. Policing would even sometimes, even now after teaching 20 years in an administrative officer's course, I'll still get an evaluation. Well, Vito's pretty good for somebody that's never been a cop. But it's, I'm not there to teach you how to be a cop. You're here to learn management, okay? That's why I'm here. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here. It's just kind of an ongoing thing, and you develop. It's kind of like in qualitative research, you have to be careful not to go native. No. That's a big problem. You have to guard against that, maintain your objectivity, stick to the protocols and your research design and how you define things, and even and then you have to be careful at the end to say, you can't overgeneralize. You can't come down really firmly, because after all your results are based on probability and to begin with. So, but I've also found if you don't interpret and you let it go, someone else will do it for you, and they'll do it in a way that you won't like or that you won't agree with. So you have to come out and say that, and that's hard for us to do. It's hard to get across to the students, when they're working on their dissertation. What are the policy implications? What does this mean? But again, if you don't do it, someone else will.
Yeah. Which brings me to sort of the second tangent I'm thinking of here. So it's a nice little segue that you've set up for us. Oftentimes these things get distilled down into sort of a bullet point, right?
Yes.
So there's a headline. You've done some work on capital punishment here.
Yes.
And that and it crosses sort of a racial tangent as well that is deemed to be problematic, and this gets put out into the public domain. How is it that you manage to express something with the sophistication that we would like to have with the qualifiers and all that thing that we in the scientific community typically use, to policymakers who want something to be able to sort of put this in a soundbite?
Yes.
How is it that has been effectively done?
See, with capital sentencing, it's, defense wants something they can use to appeal and knock it down. Then the abolitionists want something they can use to abolish. And of course, then the prosecutors are saying it's all junk anyway. It's statistical mumbo jumbo that you can manipulate one way or the other. So, it's hard. You're never going to satisfy those three groups, I found out. So you've got to stick to your findings.
Is that an advantage, not being able to satisfy everybody, that you can just sort of say that I've made my peace with this? Or is there still an issue here in terms of I need to give them something and these other groups?
Well, one time I was asked to testify in a case.
Yeah.
Okay, and it was a rehearing of a death sentence. And I told the defense attorneys, I said, look, my research can be used by the prosecution to support their views as well as yours. And if I get asked those questions by the prosecution, I'm going to have to be truthful about that. And I was, because they said, things like, well, does your research prove that this defendant was, they were biased in sentencing him? I said, no, it's a pattern. Okay, you can't go down to the individual. And then they went through, well, did you know the judge was black in this case and the prosecutor was black? But I had told defense, I said, look, they can ask all those questions and it's true. I mean, it's just, that's the way it works. You've got a pattern here. And what I've always done with our sentencing, because we've been, we did this 3 times and we're still working on it. And it always comes up with some evidence of racial bias, either by white kills black or white victim effect, or even now we're picking up a female victim effect. Even the prosecution will say to me, well, what does this mean? I said, well, I can't tell you what to do, but I can tell you what cases are problematic. In other words, you have a problem here with racial bias among the cases where black kills white. So go and examine them and do your thing. I always use the example of when we did research on drug testing and treatment for probationers and parolees. One year we had a real spike among the people who had cocaine problems. So I told the director, I said, look, you need to do your thing with them. I don't know what you're going to do. So what he decided to do was hold more treatment meetings, test them more often, and then their recidivism rate went down. Same thing with hotspots. The hotspots tell the police, go there and be police. They don't tell them what to do. Okay? So I said, you have to go and review these cases where black kills whites and see what's going on from a due process perspective and do what judges do and prosecutors do and defense attorneys do. So you're telling them where they can look. They don't need to look at everything. Okay? It's just like you go to the doctor, my elbow hurts. He doesn't look over here, he looks here.
This sounds like a very much a tried and true sort of scientific progression here, right? So
yes.
You've led us to this point. It's the job of somebody else who's interested in taking us that much further down that path to sort of figure out what questions to ask, the methodology to use, to kind of figure out what's the next insight to be gained from this. Mm-hmm. That's a really fascinating way to look at sort of the progression of policy in a lot of ways. I'm wondering if your effectiveness in the classroom, which has been well documented, has beneficial impacts in terms of communicating with these communicating research results with all these different audiences.
Yes, I think it helped. See, when I went to Long Beach, California has a long-standing program, Peace Officer Standard and Training, where they do, across the state, they set a curriculum and you do training. So Long Beach was doing this. So one of the first things Dennis Longmire and I did was a research design seminar. They'd never offered that. And, so we go through the typical stuff in the morning, and it's all police officers. And so we take the break. I said, do you have any questions? And, they more or less said, what is this crap? What are you talking about? So, we kind of rolled up our sleeves and went at it, But I mean, if you never talk to the practitioners, what are you doing? I mean, that's the way I've looked at it. You've got to get out there. I mean, because we have a tendency to talk to ourselves, read our own publications. And, even the journals that we started for practitioners, to me, are way too dense for them to really get any value out of. And it's not that you need to water it down, but you need to prescribe. Like I said, you need to say, here's what it means. And I think that's gotten a lot better over time. Yeah. Like I said, I think the police are listening, and I hope corrections is listening. The courts and the judges, I'm not so sure, but I think it's having an impact.
Is that because they see value added?
Yes. I mean, I think they're looking for direction. Because, like I said, you can't take on the whole thing. You have to find out where to go and where the problem exists, and then come up with a way to deal with it. And I think then we can evaluate that. It's, the hot spots and again, the what works in corrections, I think, a perfect example of that.
I'm thinking of some of the work that you did on CompStat as well.
Yes.
It's kind of critiquing and also giving praise where praise is due.
Yeah.
With that as a tool.
Well, what I liked about CompStat, and Bill Walsh and I looked at, we never really did research on a department. We looked at the literature and kind of made generalizations that way. But what I liked about it was the police looked at this themselves, Bill Bratton and NYPD, and said, look, here's what we need to do. And then they did it, and the crime rate went down. Now, the crime rate might have went down for other reasons, but I always use Frank Zimring's book and say, look, Frank went through everything step by step, as a lawyer would, without going into multivariate analysis. But he was doing the same thing. If we were this, then it would be that, then that. And what you're left with is what the police did. Now, did they go too far with zero tolerance and stop and frisk and all that? Yes. But I said, that's not CompStat. CompStat that's the operation. CompStat is the process of like I said, identifying what's wrong and trying to do something about it, instead of just sitting back. Because the mantra, and when I was in graduate school, was the police can't do anything about crime. It just exists, and they just kind of manage it or put up with it, respond to it. They can't really do anything about it. And I always said, well, if they're not, who the hell is? Then, whose job is this? So, they came up with that. They did it on their own. They trained people. In fact, they used to do a conference, and we went to one, Walsh and I, and several people from Louisville Police Department, to New York City. And, Giuliani was there. And this was after Bratton, which was the other thing that impressed me, too, because usually when the chief changes or the commissioner, then the programs leave, too. It's just, and the universities like that as well, that. And it stayed. I mean, we're through how many, Bratton came back again, and it's still there. He did it out in Los Angeles, and it seemed to work. But it just made a lot of logical sense to me. And they did it themselves. They did it without us. They did it without grant money, Yeah. So it was really amazing to me just on that level. And I think it's made a difference, because if nothing else, what it's done is say, look, let's look at the data. We have all this data. What do we do with it? Where do we have a problem? I mean, when I observed, granted, it was only one observation of a CompStat meeting, but how many times does in a department like that do the officers meet with the head of the whole thing and the chief of detectives and they're telling them, they're coaching them, they're saying, look, have you done this, have you done that, and then come back, try that and come back and we'll go over it again. So you're giving direction. You're not just, there was a lot of this about, they based them and they put up pictures of Pinocchio and all. But that's New York. That's what I keep telling the police over there. I went to school with these guys. If you don't stand up to them, they'll crush you like a bug. I said, that's just New York style. But I said, don't take that as that's Comstat, because it's not. So, but there was a lot of this going on. It was like theory X combined with theory Y in organizational behavior. In other words, you are holding them accountable and you are being tough, but then you're coaching, okay? You're doing a lot of direct supervision and providing your expertise and helping them come up with something that will be effective based on their experience.
I think it's very telling that the Southern Police Institute is just literally like 6 steps away. Here,
well,
right?
here
the conjoining of the academic and the practical.
The institute came first.
Oh.
Institute started in 1951, and the thing I keep telling people, because I didn't know. I mean, when I came, I told you I did post training in California. Then when I went to Philadelphia, we had 4 weeks on campus for police recruits. In other words, part of their academy, and they did different things. And I did that as well. And then when I came here, I said, well, what is this? The Southern Police Institute. And I said, what do you guys do? And I found out they have this course for academic credit, 12 weeks, twice a year. Plus they do more technical training like crime scene investigation, homicide investigation, things like that. So, but what I found out was Gunnar Myrdal did this book called American Dilemma back in the 50s.
Oh, yeah.
And in that book he said, if you really want to advance civil rights, you got to do something about the police, because the police are in charge of enforcing Jim Crow laws and all those things that, get in the way of civil rights. So that's how they started the Institute. They got a Ford Foundation grant, which then was a lot of money. And they started the program to educate, and they were aiming at administrative officers, sergeants and above. In the beginning, you had a lot of chiefs and things like that come in. So it really had its heart in social justice. It tickles me and annoys me now that social justice is kind of separate, because how can it be separate from criminal justice? It can't be.
So some of your work has tweaked a couple people, let's just say. How has the work kind of endured some of the criticism it's been the recipient of? Have you won on some margins and maybe not?
Well, even when, like I said, the drug testing program I thought was really probably our best example of having influence, because we were closely tied to the people running it, and we were in on their program from the start. In other words, we were part of the development of it, setting up an information system from the get-go. Because like I told you before, a lot of times when I was at Ohio State, people would say, we got to do an evaluation, and we're 3 years into it. Well, if you haven't collected the data when you have the clients there, forget it. You can't reconstruct it. So at least we got in front of things. And that's improved too, because we do try to get involved with practitioners as they're applying for grant money, and make the evaluation part of the grant proposal, and that's what we've done a number of times.
So that sounds like it gives you an institutional backer.
Yes.
In some sense, right?
Yes.
Because they're there to defend the virtue and the value of what you're actually doing.
And the other thing that helped here was when Knowlton Johnson came here from Anchorage, he had set up the Statistical Analysis Center for the state as part of Anchorage's program. Well, then he did the same thing here when he came here, because Kentucky didn't have one. So he affiliated with the Attorney General's office and with us, and that's really where the capital sentencing project came from, because then Department of Public Advocacy came and said, we'd like to have somebody do the Baldus study, replicate the Baldus study. And I knew a little bit about Baldus. It's funny, because when I was doing my dissertation on shock probation, he came out with this article on quantitative proof of intentional discrimination. And he made the point that, before you can really evaluate that, you have to have a certain group of people that were eligible, for the program, and then some of them got it and some of them didn't. But first they've got to be eligible. And that's what I did on my dissertation with, at least with one part of it, for shock probation.
I suspect that informed some of your racial profiling and policing as well.
Yeah,
that kind of model.
And see, when I got to capital sentencing, I said, well, it's the same thing.
Right.
Here, not all murders are eligible. Not all, the prosecution doesn't always seek the death penalty even when they can, but you've got a list of cases that are eligible so that they proceed capital or they don't. So you can look at that. Now, the racial profiling, when Beth Grassi set that up with Louisville, she came into me and we were talking about it. I said, well, good, I'm glad she's not asking me to do this, because where's your eligible? I mean, police can stop anybody, and that was always, what's the baseline? That was the thing that all the researchers wrestled with, and some of them, took the interstate and watched people come on, and that's a more controlled area. But I mean, here in Louisville, you've got Indiana across the river, you've got all the rest of the counties that can drive through here. How are you going to do that? Well, then she was just walking out this door and she turned around and said, will you help me? I said, oh God. So, we never could solve that. But what we came up with was we're going to focus on what happened after they stopped somebody. Who did they search? Who did they arrest? Because then that's more under that. Then you've got that pool of people where they've been stopped, and what happens after. Now, what leads them to be stopped? I don't see how you can do that in the way Baldus prescribed. So we focused on looking after the stop, and even then we didn't pick up a lot of. We didn't pick up any racial bias. But then when my son took the data years later, and had a new technique, propensity score matching, where he could set up groups, he found some evidence of racial bias, and he published that in his dissertation and in a book.
Now, I might be seeing something here that you may not be, and tell me if it's not there. But the fact that you have these sort of multiple degrees, that you put your toe into history, then you go into public administration, then you do sociology, does that give you any more leverage here in terms of shifting gears, if I could really botch a metaphor?
Yeah, no, I think it does.
Yeah.
Because especially with the racial profiling, a lot of the articles that came out early said, there's no theory here. There's no theoretical background. When I go to meetings, I said, you guys are looking at the wrong theory. I said, is this criminological theory? No. But I said, this is organizational behavior.
And so the focal concerns comes in.
Yeah, and the focal concerns was a criminological theory.
Yeah.
But I mean, how do people decide what to do in their organization? That's another body of literature. That's another theoretical perspective. And if you're always looking at it from just your own background, you're going to miss that. You have to get out of there. And with racial profiling, we had the economists got into that, and political sciences, scientists got into that. And we didn't always agree with how they did things, but they had a different perspective that maybe we wouldn't look at without them doing it.
Yeah.
So I think that helps. And I teach now, for some years I've taught a leadership class in the administrative officers class. Well, I never had that in public administration, even though Ohio State has like a leadership program that's been there forever. Yeah. I never had any contact with it. But that class, I really draw a lot of my history background to teach that class.
So in 1980, you and a friend and a colleague wrote a piece that got warm sort of reviews outside of the sort of peer review process. You remarked upon being a fledgling criminologist.
Yeah.
And so now you're at the end of your career, the sort of reaching the end stages of your career here. And could you give us some insights here in terms of the developments and some of the machinations between then and now?
Yeah, like I said, I think we've had better relationships with practitioners. We've opened up the line of communication. Yeah. We've established some real relevance to the research. from a practical point of view. And I don't think that's antithetical to theory.
Yeah.
You know, like I said, I see them all come together. And maybe, you know, others maybe disagree with me on that, but I mean, that's the way that I've seen it. So I think that's changed. It's changed a lot. But I think, you know, that to get involved with the practitioners and reach them takes a real sustained effort on our part. I mean, it's helped. One of the things that's happened is, you know, I teach them. So, you know, so that's great. They're in the classroom. We don't get that like we used to in the early days of criminal justice. You know, now our students are more, they're not in the field, okay? They might want to get into the field, and maybe they don't even want to get into the field. But I mean, we don't have that practitioner audience in the undergraduate program as much as we used to. But they hold their own conferences. Like we even have in the state, they call it the Kentucky Council on Crime and Delinquency that Corrections holds every year. And we would regularly go to that. Even Latessa, I had Latessa come down and present. Because, you know, they're working in the prison, working in probation and parole, working in juvenile justice. And many of the other faculty participated too, and some of the junior faculty are still doing that now. The prosecutors have their own conference. So even though they weren't terribly fond of my research, they had me come and talk and, you know, and attack me and everything. But that's, you know, it's, to me, that's fun. You know, it's part of the deal. And defense attorneys do it too. I mean, so you have to get out and do that. And then with the Police Institute, the AOC has a very active alumni group. They meet every year and have an alumni conference. And so I'll go and reconnect with them. So, but you know, you can go to IACP, you can go to ACA, you can go to the defense conferences and things like that. And when you're working in the area, you have to make an effort to get your stuff out there.
Yeah. Now you're no longer a fledgling criminologist.
No.
I'm wondering as you look back on your career, if we're proposing a toast to you at your 50th year here at the University of Louisville. What would you want people to toast you about?
Well, that they had found the research and the education useful and practical, and that it helped them. I do hear that from time to time. Like one of the papers I have them doing the leadership courses, the first one is of a mentor in their life. And now they've been doing that for 20 years. I'm getting papers on the students that I have taught in that class. You know, and I always love that, you know, because that's my feedback. I said, well, they went out there and they heard something, they did something different, and they made an impact, at least on this person's life, that they recognize and acknowledge. So I think that's the best kind of feedback. I mean, citations and all that's nice, but you know, it's good to hear that you've had an impact in that kind of personal way.
That is kind of neat.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you were thinking about doing things differently again, if you were a young graduate student, would you have chosen a different path, or would you have been more specialized? Or were there opportunities maybe that didn't present themselves? Sometimes people have. Are there any regrets or any sort of notions here in terms of what if?
Not really regrets. I mean, people have asked me, did you miss history? I said, well, I kind of, it's still there. I draw in it. I used it. I think it helped me. It really helped me learn how to think. It especially helped me learn how to write. I mean, we wrote. That's what we did all the time. Yeah. I mean, now.
I suspect you did a lot of reading too.
A lot of reading, a lot of writing. I mean, because now, like here at the university, we have 2 courses that are designated as writing classes. Every one of my classes was a writing class. And of course the classes were smaller. We had a lot of individualized attention. We get a lot of feedback. We do write, rewrite, and that's what I really took from history and reading. Yeah, like you said, and a lot of reading. And I'm big on reviewing the literature. That's when I hear it now. Well, we don't really need a literature review. I said, it just drives me nuts. That's a historian in me. I said, you got to find everything, and read everything, and because you'll find things in there. Like what did I noticed? Chris Coper. He did his research and he found, if the police go through every 15 minutes, even if they don't do anything, it has an effect. Well, Sir Robert Peel said that back in the night. Wow. Way back when, say go through every 15 minutes. And it was the same time too. I said, wow, 15 minutes, okay.
Incredible. Yeah.
And that's the kind of tie, if you haven't read Peel, you wouldn't know that.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of tie I think you should make. In terms of background, it's really hard to keep up with advances in statistics.
Yeah.
And like I said, I was a history major, so like I took Math 101 and got a D or something, So it wasn't a tool, okay? So I'm like this all through graduate school, hanging on, and then I finally came up with, well, the best way to learn something is to teach it. So I started to teach the statistics classes wherever I were.
And now you're writing textbooks.
Whenever I were, and that's where the textbooks came from. That's what Latessa and I did, and then Mike Blankenship and I, and now Tewksbury and Julie Kunzelman and Geeta Suresh. I haven't kept up with that. It's just something I haven't done. So, but I get a lot of help from people like Tom Kyle and George Higgins and my son, who are more up to date with that stuff, And I kind of learned that from Frank Cullen. Here, you guys do that now. And then I'll look at it and tell you what it means.
Yeah. Everybody's got a role. Everybody's got a role.
We all have a role, yeah. So more of that. And then also, I think if I had done a little bit more study of organizational behavior and theory, like Latessa did that, because it was kind of funny. We had this professor who was rough.
Yeah.
And I didn't know that when I took him. But after I took him, I appreciated that. Well, then I came to take the second class, and Latessa was just coming in, and he said to me, oh, you're going to take that class? I said, yeah, take it with me. You'll love it. Because this guy would do write, rewrite, and you had to write every case. He gave us case method. You had to write every case to an A. Okay? If not, if you got a C on one of them, he'd give you a C for the class. And he was no joke.
Yeah.
Well, then Latessa took him for like a seminar. I said, are you nuts? He's going to put you on a spit and baste you and roast you. But we appreciated that he was demanding, but there were like 60 students in that class, and he's reading all our cases, all of them, as you write and rewrite. I mean, he's not just sitting there, reading the newspaper or something. And in fact, he contacted me when I was out in California because there was an article about my dissertation in the paper. And I hadn't talked to him for years, and he's found me and sent that to me, and, And then, lo and behold, I do have an organizational behavior textbook now. I think it would have helped if I had done more on that side. I think that would help, because like I said, you got to expose yourself to other theories, especially in criminal justice when you're dealing with organizations. Yeah. That's who you're dealing with. That's what it's made up of. Individual actors.
So I guess that sort of checks our box for sort of the question of advice to sort of young scholars.
Yes.
Anything else in terms of?
Well, there's a tendency for us to get wrapped up in our research, and I think you've got to remember that the real purpose of being here is education. I mean, that's why you're here. You got to, and you've got to reach out and don't neglect the undergraduates, they need help. They need direction. After all, who did that for me? It's kind of like paying back or paying it forward, as they say. Because I was the biggest pest when I was undergraduate. I mean, it was in my professor's offices all the time. I mean, if somebody did that to me now, I'd throw them down the fire escape, But I think you really need to do that.
So what makes you such an effective instructor? Are there tips? Is there advice? Is it the integration of the research into the classroom? Is it Is it your persona?
I think it helps, but it's also I had really good examples. Like the one I always look towards for teaching. Not that I had more than one, but the one that always stood out to me was Dinitz. Dinitz could come in, no notes, and have the whole class like this in the palm of his hand. And the time would go by so fast, you'd think, what, we're done now? Woody Hayes used to come in and sit in the back of his class and listen to the class when I was at Ohio State. And he told me when he came here I talked to him about this more after he came here as a visiting professor. And he told me he had to learn to do that when he was at Wisconsin as a GA, because they had these giant classes in Quonset huts that they got from like the military. And they were gigantic, and you had to project, and you had to, demonstrate, and you had to be forceful, and you had to really, he said he'd come out of there like shaking, and so he's always been my model in the classroom. And you got to make that connection. And I think also you've got to look at, as you teach a course, what works, what doesn't work, what you need to put in now that's new and relevant. And that's the way I've always looked at my textbooks. To me, the textbook is a good review of the literature that's current. That's what you're giving the students. And I think that's what you need to do in the classroom, even go beyond what's in the textbook. I hope they can read the text. I hope they read the textbook. Sometimes I wonder.
But how do you do that with stats?
Stat.
And you also talked about theory being difficult to kind of communicate these sort of ethereal ideas here in terms of what does this mean for me?
Yeah, and you've got to make the connection to a program or something when you do theory. And I think it helps to use audio visual. One of my graduate students called me Captain Video. This was back before it was on. But in my leadership course, we look at movies. My cases are movies, okay, either clips or the whole thing. When we talk about the different theories of leadership, like servant leadership, transformational leadership, we analyze a movie. And I didn't think of that. I got that from the other people that were teaching leadership at other universities, and they put their stuff online. And I kind of modified it to fit our textbook and what we were doing. But because I always get in evaluations, like even now, the last class, and I didn't know how this was going to work with the movies, but it works, and because from my organizational behavior class, we were kind of wedded to that case method from Harvard Business School. And but I said, well, if I read the cases, it's going to be real dry and so on. But the thing about I really get spoiled teaching in the ALC because they're adults who have come here, left their home and their families for 12 weeks, so they're committed. I don't ask questions and get this, hands go up and debates fly, and it's like I can just sit there and listen, because they're here for the reason. As one ALC graduate told me, we're here for the reason, not for the season. So, and you don't get that so much with the undergrad. With the undergraduates, you got to prod them and demand things and crack the whip and all that.
Typically, one of the worries that you hear from us professor types is that you've got to find that fine line with teaching and the investment in it, because you've got sort of scholarly concerns that sort of require that as well, right? Require your attention. Yeah. Right? That R&R isn't going to fix itself, right?
Right.
How has that been effectively
managed? What I found through the years was you can over prepare for class. Even online. Online is even worse because there's wikis and blogs and discussion boards. And if you did all these things, you'd never do anything else, and you can't do that. You've got to balance things. In other words, you've got to decide this is enough. Okay, and it's the same thing with the research. You have to decide what you want to do research on. Part of the problem of doing the research that I've done is you seldom pick the topic.
Somebody comes knocking on your door and says, I've got an emergency.
I need this done, or there's grant money attached to it. I remember this is time I wish I had back. I spent 3 years on a community drug thing that led to no publication or nothing. But it was like, $500,000 grant, So I worked on it. And so that's part of the drawback of grant research. But I think you can be more selective about that than I was too.
Yeah.
You don't have to go after everything that moves.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I remember a dean telling me when we were working on a tenure case, I said, how do you evaluate? You've got all these disciplines. Our college is like, the College of Arts and Sciences, U of L, would be like the 16th largest college in America if it was a separate college. So that's how big it is. So I said, how do you do that? You got chemistry and music and, physics and us. And he says, I look for, are you known for something? Do you have you focused on an area? And so no matter what the field is, I can see if you've made a contribution. And I think he was right, and I think that's what you have to pay attention to as much as you can.
Yeah. So, sort of a general question here. I guess it's sort of two parts. Thoughts on sort of the intellectual state of affairs within criminal justice as an industry, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And then, can you give us some sort of insights in terms of what's on the horizon or what ought to be on the horizons for us in terms of either a practical agenda or sort of research inquiry that needs attention?
Well, again, my bias is to the applied. And I think, that's what we need to focus on and get involved in. I think that's how we can help the practitioners, because it's not something they typically do on their own. In fact, I've told officers in my class, because they're, like I said, they're all administrators. I said, go to your local college and see. You go to them and say, look, would anybody be interested? We need research on this. Would you be interested in doing it? And so they approach as well as us approach. But I think we have to too. We must do that too. You have to get out and make contacts with whatever area you're working in, whether it's police, courts, corrections, juveniles. Go out and try to meet those people that are in charge. And the thing that troubles me is, I call it, this congratulatory research. Who's the most cited? What book has been most cited? Come on. You're going to break your arm patting yourself on the back, is the way I look at it, It's just that troubles me, I said, because that's taken the emphasis off practitioners, and it's also taken it off your students. You're saying, it's all the research. And I worry about that. I hope
publishing in, I think you quoted, itty bitty journals.
Or they,
somebody who's dismissive of academics is.
Yeah, I mean, I've got into that even with our dean. They start this, the top tier journals. I said, hey, my measure's always been it's either in print or it's out of print. That's it. Because some journals are not going to publish on your topic.
Yeah.
It could be beautiful research, but it's not going to go in Criminology or JQ or, so you have to find places to put it, and where it will be read, and where it'll have some influence. And so I worry about that too.
So we talk about sort of the downside in a bit of a way here. Have you seen positive steps and positive elements in the development of criminal justice in the time that you've been doing what you've been doing?
I think, like I said, I think we've had an impact on evaluation, on policy,
all right,
and made better ties than when we started. I mean, like I told you, it was like an afterthought. We need an evaluation. Let's bring these guys in.
Yeah, there used to be sort of dismissive kinds of attitudes toward criminal justice in the incipient stages, and sort of, I've heard it referred to as handcuffs and guns.
Yeah,
in the early steps.
And sometimes it was like that.
Yeah.
I mean, when I came here, a lot of the professors had backgrounds. Most of the professors had backgrounds in law enforcement, and that was the thrust of their courses were more applied and even vocational. But you don't want to go too far away from that. I think there has to be a balance, because some of our students are trying to get into the field, and it would help them, I think, to have some kind of introduction to the subject. And they're interested in that. I know, like, we have a course on criminalistics now. Does a full-time faculty teach that? No. Not, I don't know how many people have a background PhD that could do that. But it's done, and it's done well, and it's done in an academically respectable way. And I think that's important to maintain that kind of a balance.
Yeah.
And so I think that vocational element is important, and it should be tried to maintain that, so you're not losing that element of the focus that where criminal justice started.
Yeah.
I mean, I was at a thing about, should we merge ASC and ACJS, and Bob Warden, who I'd never met before, I read his stuff in policing from SUNY Albany, said, and it should have occurred to me too, it's a lot like political science and public administration. Mm. I said, yeah, Vito, why didn't you think of that? He's exactly right. Yeah. The criminology, the criminal justice, I think it's that kind of relationship. Yeah. But I think we need to maintain that as best we can.
That's a great point. It's maybe a nice note to end on, but the last question we always conclude with, anything that, we covered an awful lot of material here. This sort of survey the land of the, surveyed sort of the progression of the field as well as your contribution to it. But is there anything that we may have left off the record that might be worthy of inclusion here?
Well, I just want to encourage, the young scholars out there to get involved and and get into the field and become a professor. I know my son's doing that now, and it kind of tickles me to see.
Where's he at?
He's at West Georgia now.
Okay.
And he won the research award for the department in his college.
So good on him.
So he's doing great. He's doing great stuff, and he's independent as a scholar. I mean, I always kept my hands off, although we've done things together. But most part, his work is his. I always tell everybody, I said, if anybody's being carried, it's me. I carried him for 18 years. It's his turn.
Well, I'm wondering if you ever get confused in the press or in print. Somebody
email, or
directing.
Yeah, email.
Well, how could you say this?
Yeah, or email all the time. It'll come to. I think you mean Anthony Vito, not Gennaro Vito. So, But I think he's. It tickles me. He says some of his colleagues will say, "I heard your father's kind of a big name." So they don't know who the hell I am. So that's good, but that's a good thing. So he's not, living on my name. He's making his own way, and I think that's good for everybody to do. I mean, I've had a really good life in this field. I'm glad I found my way. I'm glad I took that chance, crazy as it was, and went down to Ohio State and got retooled. Because it's really been rewarding.
Perfect. Great note to end on. So I'd like to thank you for your time here.
Well, thank you for
look forward to
coming
sharing
in.
this with the wider field here.
Yes.
Perfect.
Thank you.